inside Australia's highest security women's facility where the food crisis is even worse. They call it the slot. A concrete box where daylight is rationed like currency. But this isn't just any maximum security prison. This is Dame Phyllis Frost Centre, Australia's only women's Supermax facility, and what happens here behind the razor wire makes international headlines look tame. In 2023, a single meal sparked a revolt that exposed something far darker than anyone imagined. Inmates weren't just hungry. They were being systematically starved while corrections officers documented everything with clinical precision. One woman, serving life for a crime that shocked the nation, kept a diary. What she wrote in those pages would eventually reach the Australian Human Rights Commission and trigger the largest investigation into women's prison conditions in the country's history. The food trays? They were just the beginning. Because when you lock the most dangerous women in Australia inside a facility designed for psychological isolation, and then you take away the one thing that makes them feel human, something inside them breaks. And when that happens, the entire system fractures with them. But to understand how it got this bad, you need to see where this story really begins. Ravenhall, Victoria. 25 kilometers northwest of Melbourne's glittering skyline. The landscape here is deliberately unremarkable, flat, dusty, designed to be forgotten. You could drive past Dame Phyllis Frost Centre a dozen times and never notice it. That's intentional. The facility doesn't announce itself with imposing architecture. Instead, it disappears into the Australian scrubland, a maze of low-lying concrete buildings surrounded by double-layered fencing that hums with electrical current 24 hours a day. 324 women live here. Some will die here. The Supermax unit, officially called the management unit, houses just 14 of them at any given time. 14 women considered too dangerous, too volatile, or too broken for the general population. These aren't just criminals. These are the women other inmates fear. And in 2023, they stopped eating. Not as protest. As survival. Because what was being served to them wasn't food anymore. It was a message. Before we go deeper into what's really happening inside Australia's most secretive women's prison, hit that subscribe button. This story gets darker than you can imagine, and you won't want to miss where this goes. Trust me. Her name was Rebecca Hayes, though inside the facility, names became irrelevant. Inmate 47,293. Unit 3, Cell 7. Before Dame Phyllis Frost, Rebecca was a mother of two, a registered nurse, and by all accounts, unremarkable. She grew up in suburban Brisbane, married her high school sweetheart, worked night shifts at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. Colleagues described her as meticulous, compassionate, someone who remembered patient birthdays and stayed late to comfort families in the ICU waiting room. But in 2019, everything changed. Her husband died suddenly, officially ruled a heart attack. Then, 6 months later, her elderly mother passed away in her sleep. Another 6 months, her aunt. Suspicious? Perhaps. But not enough for alarm. Until investigators discovered the insulin. Massive, lethal doses administered with the precision only a medical professional could achieve. Rebecca never denied it. In court, she sat perfectly still, hands folded, expression blank. The prosecutor called her Australia's angel of death. The defense claimed untreated psychosis. The jury didn't care. Life without parole. 4 people dead, including the man who'd loved her since they were 15. And when she arrived at Dame Phyllis Frost in November 2020, the guards made sure everyone knew exactly who she was. In prison, certain crimes carry invisible scarlet letters. Child killers. Cop killers. And women who murder their families. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. 4 deaths over 18 months. Each victim had been in Rebecca's care shortly before their passing. Each had elevated insulin levels inconsistent with their medical history. Each had been healthy until they weren't. The Crown produced pharmacy records showing Rebecca had been ordering insulin in quantities far exceeding any legitimate patient need. They produced text messages to a coworker, "Sometimes mercy looks different than we think." They produced the insurance policies, 3 of them, totaling $1.2 million. But what haunted the courtroom wasn't the evidence. It was the video footage. Hospital security cameras captured Rebecca entering her husband's ICU room at 3:47 a.m. She stayed for 11 minutes. At 4:02 a.m., his monitors began alarming. By 4:15 a.m., he was dead. The footage shows Rebecca's face as she exits the room, and it's this image that newspapers would print for months. She isn't crying. She isn't panicking. She's checking her watch. The same clinical detachment appeared in footage from her mother's assisted living facility. The same cold calculation at her aunt's bedside. Prosecutors argued she'd become addicted to the power, playing God with a syringe. The defense psychiatrist testified about dissociative episodes and childhood trauma. None of it mattered. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Queensland police arrested Rebecca on a Tuesday morning while she prepared breakfast for her children. They were 7 and 9, old enough to remember everything. Detectives had waited deliberately, timing the arrest for maximum shock, minimum resistance. Rebecca was pouring orange juice when they knocked. She answered the door still holding the pitcher, still wearing her pajamas with the faded cartoon bears her daughter had picked out for Mother's Day. Senior Detective Sarah Morrison would later testify that Rebecca showed no surprise, no fear, no emotion whatsoever. When Morrison read the charges, for counts of murder, Rebecca's only response was to ask if she could finish making the kids breakfast. "They like their toast a specific way," she said. "Not too dark." The arrest made national news within hours. Camera crews camped outside her modest brick home in Ashgrove. Neighbors gave interviews describing a quiet woman who kept to herself, always smiled, never caused trouble. She baked cookies for the school fundraiser, one mother told reporters, visibly shaken. "My son played with her kids." The children were placed with Rebecca's sister. Rebecca was placed in Brisbane Women's Correctional Centre pending trial. She spent 14 months there before her conviction and transfer south to Victoria. To Dame Phyllis Frost. To the facility that would become her tomb. Justice Malcolm Hendricks delivered the sentence without mercy. "You betrayed the most sacred trusts a human being can hold," he said, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "As a wife, a daughter, a nurse, a mother. You weaponized your medical knowledge to commit premeditated murder, not once, but repeatedly, with calculating precision. Life imprisonment. For concurrent terms. No parole eligibility for 35 years. Rebecca would be 71 before she could even apply for release. The victims' families wept openly. Rebecca stared at the table in front of her, motionless. "The community must be protected from you indefinitely," Justice Hendricks continued. "And it is this court's sincere hope that you spend your remaining years contemplating the magnitude of your actions and the lives you destroyed." Then came the designation that would define the rest of Rebecca's existence, maximum security classification with psychological observation protocols. In practical terms, this meant Dame Phyllis Frost Centre. The only facility in Australia equipped to handle women deemed both dangerous and requiring constant psychiatric monitoring. As guards led her from the courtroom, Rebecca turned once to look at her children in the gallery. Her daughter was crying. Her son stared back with an expression that mirrored his mother's, blank, unreadable, already learning to feel nothing at all. Dame Phyllis Frost Centre doesn't welcome you. It processes you. Rebecca arrived in a maximum security transport van, shackled at the wrists and ankles, a chain connecting both. The journey from Brisbane had taken 18 hours with multiple security stops. She hadn't eaten. Hadn't slept. Through the van's small reinforced window, she watched the facility emerge from the flat Victorian landscape like a geometric scar. The intake procedure was designed for dehumanization. Strip search in a concrete room with drains in the floor. Cavity search by guards wearing medical gloves who never made eye contact. Every belonging catalogued, photographed, then sealed in a plastic container she'd never see again. Wedding ring, photographs of her children, the small silver cross her mother gave her at confirmation. Gone. She was issued the uniform, gray tracksuit, white t-shirt, canvas shoes without laces. No underwire in the bra. No drawstrings in anything. Every article of clothing designed to prevent suicide or violence. Then came the photographs, front, side, back, and the fingerprinting, DNA swab, and psychological intake assessment. A corrections officer with dead eyes asked if she was feeling suicidal. Rebecca said no. History of self-harm? No. Do you understand why you're here? Yes. The officer made notes without looking up. Rebecca would later learn her name was Officer Sandra Pritchard, and that Pritchard had been working at Dame Phyllis Frost for 19 years. Long enough to stop seeing inmates as human. The walk to her cell passed through 3 security checkpoints, each door requiring 2 guards and biometric verification. The facility was quieter than Rebecca expected. Not silent, you could never achieve silence in a place housing over 300 women, but muted, as if sound itself had been systematically suppressed. She noticed the cameras immediately. Every hallway, every corner, every cell door. Red lights blinking in mechanical rhythm, recording everything, forgetting nothing. Unit 3, Officer Pritchard announced, her voice flat. Maximum security. 23-hour lockdown. 1-hour yard time if you earn it. The unit was different from the general population blocks they'd passed through. Narrower corridors. Thicker doors. No common areas or dayrooms. Just cells, each one identical, each one designed for complete isolation. Your cellmate's already inside, Pritchard continued. Keep to yourself. Don't ask questions. Don't make friends. She paused at a heavy steel door marked 3 to 7. And eat what you're given. Every last bite. We don't tolerate food refusal here. Rebecca didn't understand the warning then. She would. Because inside Dame Phyllis Frost, food wasn't nutrition. It was control. It was punishment. It was the silent war waged against women the system had already declared worthless. And that war was about to escalate in ways no one could predict. Inside maximum security women's prisons, the hierarchy doesn't follow the same codes as men's facilities. There are no gangs with hand signals and territorial yards. Instead, the power structure operates through whispers, alliances built on shared trauma, and a brutal form of social Darwinism where survival depends on reading invisible cues. At the top exist the untouchables, women whose crimes or connections make them dangerous to cross. Usually, these are inmates with gang affiliations outside or those who've proven themselves capable of extreme violence inside. They control commissary networks, smuggled contraband, and most importantly, information. Below them, the workers, women who've accepted their sentences and navigate prison through compliance and usefulness. They work kitchen detail, laundry, cleaning crews. They make the facility function, and in exchange, they receive small mercies. Extended phone privileges. Better work assignments. Slightly more palatable food. Then come the ghosts, women serving life without parole who've mentally evacuated themselves from existence. They drift through the facility, speaking to no one, causing no trouble, waiting to die. And at the very bottom, the targets, child abusers, informants, and women like Rebecca whose crimes violate even criminal morality. They eat last. They get the worst cells. They learn to sleep with one eye open because protection doesn't exist for them. Rebecca understood this immediately when she entered cell 3 to 7 and met her cellmate. The woman was lying on the bottom bunk, face to the wall, but when Rebecca entered, she turned slowly. "So you're the nurse who kills people," she said. "We're going to get along just fine." Her cellmate's name was Kira Malone, and she was serving 23 years for armed robbery and aggravated assault. She'd held up a convenience store in Geelong with a knife, taken $47, and when the clerk resisted, she'd stabbed him 17 times. He survived, but barely. Kira was 31 and had been inside for 6 years. "They put you with me because I don't give a shit about your crime," Kira said, still lying on her bunk. "Also because I won't kill you in your sleep." "Probably." Rebecca remained standing by the door, taking in the 8 by 10-foot cell that would be her entire world. 2 bunks. 1 toilet with no seat. 1 sink. 1 small metal desk bolted to the wall. A single window, 4 inches wide and 3 feet tall, with reinforced glass so thick the outside world looked like an impressionist painting. No privacy. No dignity. No escape. Top bunk's yours, Kira continued. Don't touch my shit. Don't talk during count. Don't ask me about my case. We're not friends. Rebecca nodded and climbed onto the thin mattress that smelled of industrial detergent and previous despair. The ceiling was 2 feet from her face, covered in scratches and etchings from former occupants. Names, dates, crude drawings, desperate prayers. Someone had carved day 1247 into the concrete. Rebecca wondered if they'd survive to see day 1248. Lights out is at 9, Kira said. Breakfast is at 6. The food tastes like cardboard, but you'll eat it anyway. Because that's all there is. Before we go deeper into what's really happening inside Australia's most secretive women's prison, hit that subscribe button. This story gets darker than you can imagine, and you won't want to miss where this goes. Trust me. The routine at Dame Phyllis Frost was designed to break circadian rhythms and eliminate any sense of normalcy. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., fluorescent lights triggered remotely, flooding the cell with harsh brightness that made sleeping impossible. Count at 5:45, guards walking the unit, verifying every inmate through the door slot. Breakfast at 6 o'clock, delivered through that same slot, eaten in the cell because maximum security inmates didn't get communal dining. The meal was always identical: gray oatmeal, 1 slice of white bread, black coffee. No sugar. No butter. No variation. Then came 23 hours of nothing. Rebecca and Kira could request books from the library cart that came Tuesdays and Fridays. They could write letters on provided paper with tiny golf pencils that couldn't be sharpened into weapons. They could watch the small television mounted outside the cell through their door window, whatever channel the guard selected, volume controlled centrally. Lunch at 11:30. Dinner at 4:30. Evening count at 8 o'clock. Lights out at 9 o'clock. And in between, the crushing, suffocating nothingness of captivity. No programs. No counseling. No rehabilitation. Just existence, measured in identical days that bled into identical weeks into identical years. Rebecca started counting scratches on the ceiling. By week 3, she'd counted 1,847. Then she stopped, terrified of what that number meant. The first sign came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks into Rebecca's sentence. Breakfast arrived as usual: oatmeal, bread, coffee, but something was different. The oatmeal had an odd greenish tint, and the smell was wrong. Not rotten exactly, but chemical, like cleaning solution. Kira stared at her tray for a long moment, then pushed it away. Don't eat that, she said quietly. Rebecca looked at her own tray. The oatmeal moved slightly, and she realized with revulsion that there were small insects baked into it. Weevils, maybe, or some other grain pest. What do we do? Rebecca asked. Nothing. You do nothing. Through their cell window, Rebecca could see other inmates at their doors, trays in hand, identical expressions of disgust and resignation. Some were eating anyway, picking around the obvious contamination. Some were scraping the oatmeal into their toilets. No one was complaining. That was the first lesson. Within an hour, Officer Pritchard appeared at their cell. Meal refusal, she asked, her tone suggesting this was a crime equivalent to murder. The food is contaminated, Rebecca said, her nursing background making her speak up despite Kira's warning glare. Pritchard smiled. It was not a kind smile. The food is what we provide. You eat it, or you go hungry. Those are your options, 47293. She made a note on her tablet. Meal refusal documented. Commissary privileges suspended for 1 week. She walked away, leaving the contaminated trays on the floor. The contaminated food wasn't an isolated incident. It became the norm. Over the following weeks, meals arrived with visible mold, unidentifiable meat that smelled of decay, vegetables that had liquefied in their containers. Portion sizes shrank. A full breakfast became half a breakfast became a quarter. The bread was often rock hard or wet with condensation. The coffee was sometimes just hot water with brown sediment. And always, the same response when anyone complained: eat it or go hungry. Rebecca watched women around her begin to deteriorate. Kira, who'd been sturdy and strong when Rebecca arrived, started losing weight rapidly. Her cheekbones emerged sharp beneath thinning skin. Other inmates developed rashes, digestive issues, constant fatigue. The guards documented everything with clinical precision. Every refused meal. Every complaint. Every symptom. But nothing changed. In fact, it got worse. In week 7, dinner was served at 3 p.m. instead of 4:30. Then lunch disappeared entirely. Guards claimed kitchen staffing issues. Breakfast became the only guaranteed meal, and even that was barely edible. Women started hoarding commissary items, but those were expensive and limited, and for inmates like Rebecca with suspended privileges, inaccessible. The weight loss became visible throughout the unit. Women shuffling to count with sunken eyes and protruding ribs. Some fainted during the standing count, collapsing onto the concrete floor while guards watched impassively. "Medical will see you if it's an emergency," Pritchard would say, stepping over collapsed bodies. It was never classified as an emergency. Rebecca faced an impossible choice. As a nurse, she understood malnutrition's trajectory. First came the fatigue and dizziness. Then the organ stress, kidneys struggling, liver faltering, heart rhythm destabilizing. Then the immune collapse. Then death. She was watching it happen in real time, to herself and everyone around her. She could comply, eat the contaminated food and risk illness. She could refuse, starve slowly while guards documented her decline. Or she could fight. But fighting in maximum security meant risking additional punishment. Solitary confinement. Loss of remaining privileges. Violence from guards who faced no oversight. Kira made her choice clear one night after lights out. "I'm done," she whispered from the bottom bunk. "I'm not eating their shit anymore. I'd rather die on my terms than theirs." Rebecca stared at the dark ceiling, counting her heartbeat, feeling it weaker than before. She thought about her children. About whether they'd be told how she died. About whether they'd care. The system had already declared her worthless, a murderer who deserved whatever happened behind these walls. But some part of her, the part that had spent years saving lives before she'd started taking them, couldn't accept dying like this. Not from deliberate starvation orchestrated by people who claimed to represent justice. "I'm going to write to someone," Rebecca said finally. "I'm going to tell them what's happening." What Rebecca didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Dame Phyllis Frost Centre was operating under a private management contract. In 2017, the Victorian government had outsourced the facility's operations to a company called Australia's Corrections, promising taxpayer savings and innovative rehabilitation models. The contract included performance bonuses for reducing operational costs. Food service was the largest variable expense. Cut corners there, and profits soared. Australia's had hired a catering subcontractor called NutriServe, which specialized in institutional food, hospitals, schools, prisons. But NutriServe had its own cost-cutting measures. They purchased food items nearing expiration. They reduced portion sizes below nutritional guidelines. They fired experienced kitchen staff and replaced them with minimum wage workers who received minimal training. And they falsified documentation. Every meal logged as meeting caloric and nutritional standards. Every ingredient listed as fresh and properly stored. Every complaint categorized as inmate manipulation. The system was perfect. Inmates were considered unreliable witnesses, criminals whose complaints could be dismissed as lies or manipulation. Guards were incentivized to support management narratives. And oversight committees visited on scheduled tours where carefully prepared demonstration meals were served and compliant inmates were showcased. No one was checking the day-to-day reality. No one cared enough to look closely. Until Rebecca started writing letters. Letters to the Victorian Ombudsman. To prisoner advocacy groups. To journalists. To anyone who might listen. She described the contaminated food in medical terminology. She documented dates, times, specific incidents. She included names of sick inmates and their symptoms. Kira helped her smuggle the letters out through a trustee who had library access. What happens next will shock you, and I need you to make sure you're subscribed because this story is about to expose something the Australian government tried to bury. You won't believe how deep this goes. The letters reached the Victorian Ombudsman's office in November 2023. At first, they were treated like thousands of other inmate complaints, filed, categorized, scheduled for eventual review. But Rebecca's medical background made her different. She didn't rant or make emotional accusations. She presented data. She used clinical language. She described symptoms that couldn't be faked: ketosis, bradycardia, edema, amenorrhea. She documented weight loss percentages that crossed into life-threatening territory. A junior analyst named David Chen actually read the letters carefully. Something about the detail bothered him. He cross-referenced Rebecca's claims against facility medical records that were technically public but rarely requested. The numbers matched. Women at Dame Phyllis Frost were experiencing medical emergencies at rates 3 times higher than comparable facilities. Malnutrition-related hospital admissions had increased 347% since Australians took over management. But here was the damning evidence: Australians had been billing the government for full nutritional food service while actually providing meals worth approximately $1.80 per inmate per day, less than what animal shelters spent on dog food. The contract specified minimum $4.50 per inmate daily food costs. The difference, roughly $2.70 per inmate across 324 inmates, translated to annual savings of over $300,000. Money that went directly into Australia's corrections profit margin. David Chen forwarded Rebecca's letters to his supervisor with a memo marked "Urgent Investigation Required." Inside the facility, word spread about Rebecca's letters. The response split the population. Some women saw her as hope, finally, someone who could articulate their suffering to the outside world with credibility. They started sharing their own stories, medical histories, documentation of weight loss and illness. An inmate named Jasmine Torres, serving 15 years for manslaughter, had kept meticulous records of every meal for 8 months. She showed Rebecca a notebook filled with tiny handwriting: January 14th, oatmeal, moldy, bread, hard, coffee, cold. January 15th, no breakfast. January 16th, oatmeal, bugs visible. Others saw Rebecca as dangerous. "You're going to get us all punished," a woman named Michelle hissed through cell doors during count. "They'll make it worse. They always make it worse." She was right to be afraid. Officer Pritchard and her colleagues began targeting anyone associated with Rebecca. Cell searches became daily occurrences: belongings dumped, mattresses slashed, personal items confiscated for contraband violations. Women lost commissary privileges for invisible infractions. Yard time was cancelled for entire units. The message was clear: complaining has consequences. But Kira stood firm. "Let them come," she told Rebecca. "I've got nothing left to lose anyway." She started organizing. Quiet conversations during the brief moments when cell doors opened for count. Whispered plans during the chaos of medication distribution. A coordinated response was forming. Not a riot, those were futile in maximum security. Something more strategic. More devastating. A complete hunger strike. On December 3, 2023, 47 women in Unit 3 refused breakfast. They didn't destroy the trays. Didn't shout or protest. Simply slid them back through the door slots untouched, then sat on their bunks in silence. The guards were unprepared for coordinated resistance. Officer Pritchard went cell to cell, documenting refusals, her face growing redder with each notation. By lunch, the number had grown to 63. By dinner, 81 women across the maximum security unit were refusing all food. The administration's response was immediate and brutal. Facility lockdown. All movement suspended. No yard time, no showers, no phone privileges. Medical staff were sent cell to cell, forcing inmates to sign forms acknowledging they were refusing food against medical advice. "You understand this could kill you?" a nurse asked Rebecca, holding out a clipboard. "Yes," Rebecca replied. "Like the contaminated food you've been serving is killing us anyway." The nurse said nothing, made her notation, moved to the next cell. But the strike created an immediate problem for Australia's corrections: documentation. Every refused meal had to be logged. Every inmate assessed daily for medical deterioration. Every incident reported to government oversight. And now, with dozens of women simultaneously starving themselves, those reports would draw attention. Exactly what the administration had been avoiding. By day 3 of the strike, the media had the story. Mass hunger strike at Victorian Women's Prison appeared on evening news broadcasts. Reporters camped outside the facility gates. Politicians started asking questions. David Chen's investigation had progressed faster than anyone expected. With media attention intensifying, the Ombudsman's office escalated Rebecca's case to a full inquiry. They demanded unannounced facility inspections. They subpoenaed Australia's corrections financial records. They interviewed former kitchen staff who'd quit rather than participate in what one called institutionalized cruelty. The plan wasn't Rebecca's alone anymore. It had evolved into something larger, a coordinated effort between striking inmates, outside investigators, advocacy groups, and journalists who'd finally started paying attention. Inside, the women had agreed to continue refusing food until specific demands were met: independent nutritional assessment of all meals, immediate termination of the NutriServe contract, medical evaluation for every inmate showing malnutrition symptoms, and most radically, criminal investigation into Australia's corrections executives for fraud and reckless endangerment. Outside, David Chen was building a legal case that could dismantle the entire private prison contract. He'd found evidence of falsified inspection reports, forged nutritional compliance documents, and a pattern of medical negligence that spanned 18 months. The government was facing a potential scandal that could bring down the corrections minister. Australia's was facing criminal charges. And inside Dame Phyllis Frost, 81 women were slowly starving themselves to death, betting everything on the hope that their suffering would finally matter to someone. On day 7 of the hunger strike, the first woman collapsed during morning count. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, serving 12 years for drug trafficking. She hit the concrete floor with a sound that echoed through the unit, bone on stone, the sharp crack of a skull impacting with nothing to cushion it. Guards rushed to her cell, but she wasn't responsive. Paramedics arrived 20 minutes later. By then, Sarah had regained consciousness but couldn't stand. Her blood pressure was critically low. Her heartbeat erratic. They transported her to the hospital, and the media captured footage of the ambulance leaving the facility. That image, that single moment of undeniable medical crisis, became national news. Woman hospitalized after prison hunger strike appeared on every major outlet. Suddenly, this wasn't just inmate complaints. This was visible, documented harm occurring in real time. Rebecca watched from her cell window as the ambulance disappeared, lights flashing against the gray Victorian sky. She knew what this meant. They'd crossed the point of no return. Either the system would break, or they would. Kira was weaker now, barely able to stand for count. Most of the striking women were showing severe symptoms: dizziness, fainting, heart palpitations. Rebecca, using her nursing knowledge, tried to monitor everyone's condition, shouting medical advice through door slots, trying to identify who was in most danger. But the truth was, they were all in danger. Day 7. And they'd agreed to strike until day 14 if necessary. Day 9 brought the Australian Human Rights Commission. 3 representatives arrived unannounced at 6 a.m., demanding immediate access to all maximum security units. The facility director, a man named Robert Hargrove who'd been conspicuously absent during the strike, was forced to allow them entry under federal authority. They went cell to cell, documenting conditions with cameras and voice recorders. When they reached Rebecca's cell, she was ready. She'd organized her documentation, letters, Jasmine's meal logs, medical observations, names of hospitalized inmates. She spoke clearly despite the weakness, describing in clinical detail what had been happening for months before the strike even began. The commissioners took notes. Photographed the cell. Examined the contaminated breakfast tray that had been delivered that morning, oatmeal with visible mold, bread so hard it could be used as a weapon. They interviewed Kira, who could barely speak but managed to say, "They're killing us slowly and calling it corrections." By midday, the commissioners had seen enough. They held an emergency press conference outside the facility gates. "We have observed conditions that constitute cruel and degrading treatment," the lead commissioner stated, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "Inmates are being systematically deprived of adequate nutrition. Medical needs are being ignored. This facility is in violation of multiple human rights statutes, and we are recommending immediate federal intervention." The press conference was broadcast live. Within hours, the Victorian Premier was forced to respond. Australia's corrections stock price dropped 23% in a single trading session. And inside Dame Phyllis Frost, 81 women waited to see if their suffering had finally become impossible to ignore. But the government's response wasn't what they'd hoped for. Instead of immediate reform, instead of terminating Australia's contract, the Premier announced a comprehensive review process that would take 6 months. 6 months. The striking women didn't have 6 months. By day 11, 3 more inmates had been hospitalized. Rebecca herself was experiencing severe symptoms, constant dizziness, heart arrhythmia, vision problems. Kira was worse. She'd stopped being able to walk to the toilet, urinating into cups because standing made her faint. "We can't hold on much longer," Rebecca told the advocacy lawyer who'd finally been granted access to meet with strike organizers. "We need action now, not promises." The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, was blunt. "The government is betting you'll break first. They're waiting for someone to die so they can call it suicide and discredit the entire movement." Rebecca understood the calculation. They were criminals. Their lives were considered expendable. The public might sympathize briefly, but outrage was temporary. The system would outlast their resistance because the system always did. Unless they changed tactics. "What if we don't wait to die?" Rebecca asked slowly. "What if we demand emergency medical intervention under duty of care statutes? Force them to either provide adequate nutrition or admit they're allowing harm?" Day 13. 76 women remained on strike, 5 had been hospitalized, deemed too medically unstable to continue. Rebecca drafted a formal demand, using legal language Patricia had provided. It was simple: provide nutritionally adequate meals within 24 hours, or face federal intervention for violation of duty of care. The facility would have to either comply or defend the indefensible in court. They delivered the demand at 6 a.m. on day 14, sliding copies under every guard's feet during count. No more negotiations. No more waiting for reviews or committees. 24 hours. Officer Pritchard read the demand and laughed. "You're in no position to make ultimatums, for 7293, she said. But her laugh sounded hollow. Because behind her, in the administration building, emergency meetings were happening. Australia's executives were conferring with government lawyers. The math had changed. Defending current food service would mean admitting inadequacy in court, under oath, with national media coverage. The alternative was compliance, expensive, profit-reducing, accountability-demanding compliance. At 3:47 p.m., 17 hours into the ultimatum, trucks arrived at the facility's service entrance. Not NutriServe trucks. Trucks from an actual commercial catering company, the kind that served hospitals and schools with real oversight. Dinner that night was hot soup, fresh bread, fruit, and actual protein, chicken that looked like chicken, not gray mystery meat. Women wept as they ate. Some were too weak to hold spoons and had to be fed by cellmates. Rebecca took one bite of bread and realized it was the first real food she'd tasted in 14 days. Kira ate 3 bites before vomiting from shock to her damaged digestive system. The strike ended, but the investigation was just beginning. Within a week, the Victorian government announced termination of Australia's corrections contract, effective immediately. Facility management would return to state control. Nutriserve's license was suspended pending criminal investigation. Robert Hargrove, the facility director, was placed on administrative leave. Officer Sandra Pritchard was transferred to administrative duties, banned from inmate contact pending review of her conduct. David Chen's investigation uncovered evidence of systematic fraud. Australians had been billing for meals never served, medical care never provided, rehabilitation programs that existed only on paper. The financial audit revealed the company had extracted $4.7 million in excess profits over 3 years through deliberate deprivation of basic services. Criminal charges were filed against 3 executives. But for Rebecca and the other women, the victory was hollow. 5 inmates had permanent medical damage from malnutrition. Sarah Mitchell had suffered a stroke from which she'd never fully recover. 2 women who'd been close to release had additional charges filed, inciting prison disruption, adding years to their sentences. And the psychological trauma of those months couldn't be legislated away. Trust in the system, already minimal, had been completely destroyed. They'd learned the hardest lesson: their humanity had to be fought for, constantly, against a system designed to deny it. Rebecca received notice that her commissary privileges were reinstated. That her letters had been instrumental in the investigation. That she'd helped expose one of the worst cases of institutional neglect in Australian prison history. None of it made her children call. The new food service began immediately, but trust couldn't be restored as easily. Women inspected every meal with paranoid scrutiny, still expecting contamination, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. It took weeks before most could eat without anxiety. The medical evaluations revealed the damage. 70% of maximum security inmates showed signs of chronic malnutrition. 15 required ongoing cardiac monitoring. 8 had developed stress-related psychological conditions requiring medication. Rebecca was diagnosed with malnutrition-induced neuropathy and irregular heartbeat. Kira had permanent kidney damage. They would both live, but their bodies would carry the evidence forever. The facility implemented new protocols: independent nutritional oversight, quarterly health assessments, ombudsman access without prior notification, and an inmate grievance system with external review. On paper, Dame Phyllis Frost became a model for reform. But the women who'd lived through those months knew the truth. Systems don't change because they want to. They change because they're forced to. Because people in powerless positions found the strength to make their suffering visible. Because someone like Rebecca, despite her crimes, despite her guilt, despite deserving punishment, still deserved to be treated like a human being. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd taken lives. The system had tried to slowly take hers. Both acts were called justice. The Parliamentary inquiry convened in February 2024. Rebecca was transported under guard to provide testimony, the first time she'd left Dame Phyllis Frost in 16 months. The committee room was nothing like a courtroom. More intimate, less formal, but somehow more intimidating. Politicians who'd never been inside a prison asking questions about existence they couldn't fathom. Rebecca told her story methodically. Described the contaminated food, the deliberate starvation, the medical neglect. She presented Jasmine's meal logs, her own medical observations, documentation of hospitalized inmates. She spoke for 2 hours without notes. When she finished, the committee chair, a woman named Senator Elizabeth Vaughan, asked one question: why should the public care about the suffering of convicted criminals? The room went silent. Rebecca met the senator's eyes. Because we're still human, she said quietly. I killed people. I deserve punishment. But slow starvation isn't punishment, it's torture. And if you allow that to happen to us, you're saying there are circumstances where torture is acceptable. Where profit matters more than humanity. where some people can be treated as less than human. That precedent doesn't stop at prison walls, Senator. It spreads. The testimony was broadcast nationally. Public opinion, which had been mixed, shifted decisively. Australia's corrections filed for bankruptcy within 6 months. For Rebecca personally, the consequences were complicated. She became a symbol, both hero and villain depending on who was telling the story. Prison reform advocates held her up as proof that even those guilty of terrible crimes deserved basic human rights. Victims' rights groups condemned her, arguing that a murderer didn't deserve sympathy regardless of mistreatment. Both perspectives had validity. Both missed the point. Rebecca wasn't asking for sympathy. She was demanding accountability. A system that claimed to represent justice while allowing torture in its name wasn't a justice system, it was a revenge system operating under legal cover. The investigation resulted in significant reforms across Australia's corrections system. Private prison contracts were reviewed nationally. Nutritional standards were federally mandated and independently audited. Inmate grievance procedures were strengthened with external oversight. But Rebecca would spend the rest of her life in prison. The hunger strike didn't reduce her sentence or erase her crimes. 4 people were still dead by her hand. Her children were still growing up without their mother, carrying the weight of knowing what she'd done. Justice, in her case, meant decades in a cell, no matter how much the conditions improved. She'd saved lives through her advocacy, exposed systemic abuse, forced institutional change. And still, every night, she lay in that bunk and counted the scratches on the ceiling, knowing she'd add thousands more before she saw freedom. If she ever did. Rebecca Hayes remains incarcerated at Dame Phyllis Frost Centre. As of 2026, she's served 6 years of her life sentence. She works in the facility's medical unit now, helping other inmates navigate health issues, though she's forbidden from direct patient care. Her children are teenagers, she sees them twice a year during supervised visits. The meetings are painful, stilted, filled with the weight of everything that can't be said. Kira Malone was released in 2025 after serving her full sentence. She left with permanent medical issues and no family waiting, another woman consumed and discarded by a system that views rehabilitation as optional. She writes to Rebecca occasionally, short letters about the difficulty of existing outside after so long inside. Officer Sandra Pritchard was terminated following the investigation. She filed a wrongful dismissal suit claiming she was following management directives. The case is pending. David Chin received a commendation from the Ombudsman's office and continues investigating institutional abuse cases across Victoria. Patricia Okonkwo, the advocacy lawyer, now specializes in prison conditions litigation. She visits Rebecca quarterly, not as a lawyer anymore, but as something approaching a friend. Because some bonds are forged in battles that leave permanent scars on everyone involved. There's a question that haunts the aftermath of Dame Phyllis Frost. What does justice mean in a system that dehumanizes as policy? Rebecca committed terrible crimes. She deserves punishment, that's not in dispute. But the hunger strike revealed a deeper truth about how society defines worth. The system said her crimes made her unworthy of basic human dignity. She proved that dignity isn't granted by institutions, it's claimed by individuals who refuse to be erased. The women who struck weren't asking for freedom or forgiveness. They were demanding the minimum standard of humane treatment that we extend to animals in shelters, to prisoners of war under international law. They were saying, punish us, yes, but don't torture us. Hold us accountable, yes, but don't starve us. The fact that this was controversial says everything about what we've allowed justice to become. Revenge disguised as righteousness. Profit masquerading as public safety. Cruelty rationalized as consequence. And the most disturbing aspect? Dame Phyllis Frost wasn't an aberration. It was just the one that got exposed. Across Australia, across the world, similar systems operate in shadows, treating human beings as problems to be managed rather than people capable of change. The hunger strike didn't fix that. It just made it temporarily impossible to ignore. Rebecca's diary, the one that started everything, is now held in the State Library of Victoria's archives. It's been requested by researchers, journalists, documentary filmmakers. The pages are filled with precise medical observations written in increasingly shaky handwriting as malnutrition progressed. The last entry, written on day 13 of the strike, reads, "If I die here, let it mean something. Let someone remember we were human." She didn't die. She survived. And her testimony, along with 76 other women who refused to disappear quietly, changed Australian prison policy permanently. But the work isn't finished. Systems resist reform. Profits incentivize cruelty. And without constant vigilance, the conditions that created Dame Phyllis Frost's nightmare will replicate themselves elsewhere, in different forms, targeting different populations who lack power to resist. That's why stories like this matter. Not to glorify criminals, but to remember that justice without humanity isn't justice at all, it's just institutional revenge that corrodes everyone it touches. If this story made you think differently about justice, punishment, and what we owe even those who've committed terrible crimes, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment with your thoughts, I read every single one. And next week, I'm covering another case that'll challenge everything you think you know about the prison system. You won't want to miss it.